and 1. West Coast Davenger faithful, Davengerinos, we have today one of the most prolific writers in all of comics history and surely in the last 30 to 35 years, Mark Waid, with us today. And just, I could run down your bibliography, but that would take 45 minutes. So, so I've just, uh, one of the most known books is Kingdom Come, but runs on Flash, JLA, Impulse, Superman, Cap, the big 52 DC weekly series, Irredeemable, Incorruptible, and so much other great work. And most recently, The
Yeah.
Last Days of Lex Luthor.
Very proud of that one. Yeah.
You know, I will say this, I know you probably heard, I'm not a huge Superman guy, but I've read that, and I've read some other stuff recently. I reread Superman for All Seasons recently, and then Birthright, which is yours. You know, there's some great stories about, the Man of Steel that just really do it.
Dude, if you can't love Superman after reading that stuff, I don't know what to tell you.
No, and that's the thing, like, it takes for such a huge history of a character like that. There's so many stories, but there are some that really hit it, and I'm really enjoying this first issue of The Last Days of Lex Luthor.
Thank you.
And I wanna ask you, how long has this story been gestating with you?
A long ass time. At least 5 years. The backstory is that under the previous publishing regime, one of the younger editors came to me and five or so years ago, maybe longer, and said, we want you to pitch something for Black Label. I said, no, it's not going to happen. Well, we want have it a Superman thing for Black Label. I said, it will never be published. Well, just think about it, okay? You must have some ideas in your back pocket. I'm like, I really don't, because I just assumed I would never be able to work there again. And then, she said, go, just think about it. Just think about it. And so I went home, and God damn it, if I didn't have the idea of a lifetime for this thing, and all of a sudden it came out. So I pitched it. It didn't fly. Brian Hitch attached himself to it. No interest. And then the publishing regime changed, as it does, and everything, as with all sorts of regime changes in entertainment, whether it's movies or comics or whatever, the new management is like, let's take a look and see what's there. And so it got approved that day, the first day of new management. And so that was about a year and change ago, I guess.
Yeah.
And so it's been full steam ahead ever since.
And I know I've heard you say, and I've heard people mention it's in the Birthright timeline, or it's a spiritual sequel. I've heard the term.
Spiritual sequel. There's nothing in it that contradicts Birthright specifically, and
Right.
it's very much the history and characterizations of Superman and Luthor that I set out in Birthright. It is not necessarily a sequel per se,
right?
But you'll see as you get to it.
Well, it's the telescope that so far that connects it. I noticed that right away. And that's such an interesting thing, like for a physical object to kind of connect two stories.
Yeah.
I do like that. I did want to ask, I wanted to go back to the beginning, because one of the things that fascinates me about your career is that you got to start with Amazing Heroes.
Yep.
And, fanzines are not so much anymore. They don't really exist. The internet kind of did away with that, but fanzines are such an important part of comics history. And I think there's just a little bit of that's kind of lost on the generations that came after it.
Yeah. There's a difference between knocking out, a 200 word, soundbitey, listicle for resources, and doing, a 2,000 word, essay on, what's coming up at Marvel Comics next month, whatever. It's a completely different form of writing. It's a completely different discipline. And I do miss it. I do miss long form articles in fanzines, like you said, Amazing Heroes, Comics Journal, the Comics Buyer's Guide,
Comic Reader.
God, I love the Comic Reader. And that's the kind of stuff that you just don't. I mean, there's still fanzines. Don't get me wrong. Back issue,
Yeah.
Alter Ego, Retro Fan, Tomorrow's does a great job with them, but
Mhm.
they're the last man standing.
Yeah, yeah. It's kinda surprising too because, you would think well, I mean, comics, the Comics Journal still exists, but it's a little bit different than what it used to be.
Yeah,
Um, but how did that happen? How did you get to that part? I'm sorry. How did you end up working with Amazing Heroes and writing for them and doing some editing?
it was really my interest in doing nonfiction writing. I never thought of myself as a
Mhm.
fiction writer. I never had any aspirations of writing fiction, but I knew I was a wordsmith. I knew I could write nonfiction, and so
Yeah.
a late friend of mine named Kevin Gould, who was a Legion fan along with me, Legion of Superheroes fan along with me. Let me back up. Okay, so here's the other missing link in the fanzine slash internet reporting is
Yeah.
that do you know about APA's Amateur Press Association stuff?
I don't.
Okay, so this was the internet of the 1990s. What I don't know if there are any still in business. Kappa Alpha was one from which Mark Verheiden and a bunch of other comics pros to be arose. Uh,
Mhm.
Interlac was the one that was focused on Legion. And what it was a group of like 50 of us or whatever. There was a membership. There was a membership limit for reasons that will become apparent in a second. About 50 people in Interlac, and as people left, other people would join. Um,
Mhm.
and so what you do, so you get 50 people in the group, right? So what you would do is you would write your own newsletter or fanzine or something about the topic at hand, Legion, or really kind of anything.
Mhm.
You would write it up, print it out, go to Kinko's, print up 50 copies of it, and send that to a central mailer, whose job it was then to collate everyone's newsletters that month and reissue them, so you'd get a giant pack in the mail this
Yeah.
thick that was a bound, I mean, bound, stapled, volume of stuff. I that was my first really intro, was getting into Interlac and doing that, and that's how I met Kevin. And from
Mhm.
there, we knew Amazing Heroes was a possible market for something that could be seen by more than 50 people.
Oh, yeah.
And so we pitched an idea, then we pitched another idea, and then I started doing stuff on solo with it because Kevin just was a great guy, but just kind of this wasn't his wheelhouse.
Mhm.
And so I got to be such a regular contributor there that I made two things happen. First off, I got great contacts at Fantagraphics. I worked with the late
Right.
Kim Thompson. The late is a word that I'm uncomfortable at how many times I'm using in this interview. But
Uh,
uh, Kim Thompson was heading at Fantagraphics at the time. I made good contacts with Kim. Kim sort of recognized me as like their utility infielder on Amazing Heroes. I was the guy who could always be counted on to come through with the article in a hurry. Uh, so I went to work doing a lot of freelance work for Amazing Heroes and their other magazines, Fantagraphics. The other effect of that, besides making contacts at Fantagraphics, was because I was doing interviews with writers, artists, editors, publishers.
mhm.
That created for me a relationship between those people. It sort of it was networking before we
Yeah.
used that way, um, and so in the networking of it, I the biggest fish I landed, if you will, in terms of just getting to know somebody was Julius Schwartz, who was at that time the editor of the Superman books. He'd been at DC since 1944. He was, a long time respected editor. And while other editors would not necessarily give me the time of day because I was just some rando,
Mhm.
Julie came from fandom. He and Superman
Right.
editor Weisinger were among the very first science fiction fans back in the 30s before that term even became commonplace. And so Julie knew from fans, and he
Mhm.
was always keeping an eye for new talent on the beginners. He was always willing to give
Yeah.
the beginners a break. And so I sold my first story to Superman, or to Action Comics, a Superman story, It was terrible, but Julie bought it, and that sort of was the next step in my career. But that is a very long answer to a very short question, but that is my stepping stone through Amazing Heroes, through Fantagraphics, and then on from there.
But that's fascinating to me because everybody has to start somewhere,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And,
And as I'm fond of saying, breaking into comics is like breaking out of a high-tech security prison, which is to say that the moment they figure out how you got in, they will immediately seal it up so that nobody else can get in that way ever again. And that path doesn't exist anymore.
no, no. I mean, isn't it Shooter stories kind of unique too, right? Shooter
Yeah,
broke in at like 13 or 14 or something like that.
yeah, by making
You know,
his
but
own comics and sending them into DC Comics. That was
yeah,
astounding.
it would never happen like that today, like you
No, of
said.
course. That whenever Paul Levitt started working at DC when he was like 16, 17, back, when it was technically illegal to put a
Yeah.
16-year-old on staff, stuff like that wouldn't happen today.
But it's an industry that was built for the most part on people doing stuff like that, like finding ways to get in. And
Yes.
and it, it's it and fans have always been a part of that. I'm pretty sure I've heard Neil Gaiman talk about being a fan of comics and just kind of writing, and he met Alan Moore, and then,
Yeah.
it went from there. And he was one of the first you edited some of his first stories, right?
Yes. Yeah, I did. It did. I edited a couple of Secret Origin story, and then a whole Batman themed Secret Origins annual that we did. And it was fun working with him. I mean, I don't really have any great stories other
Yeah.
than he was just delightful to work with. I have stories
Yeah.
about him on a comic book legal defense fund cruise, but that's a whole nother day. And they're good stories. They make me look stupid. Um, I worked with him. That was the beauty of working on Secret Origins, which was our anthology book, is I get to work with
Mhm.
every single writer at DC, and people who were just starting out at DC, and people who'd been there forever, and just all those scripts coming across my desk, and how much I learned about writing
Yeah.
sitting there.
I mean, it's the best way to become great in your field is just kinda sitting, listening, learning, and then eventually, pulling the trigger on whatever it is that you're gonna do.
There are a lot
Um,
worse ways to learn to write comics than be Neil Gaiman's and Grant Morrison. Yes.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an amazing thing. I wanted to touch upon the art of the comic store is something that fascinates me. Over the last 2 years alone, I've probably been to about 65 comic stores up and down the West Coast, just taking
Wow.
road trips. And, we're fortunate. We're West Coasters. Well, I know you live in LA,
Yeah.
and we're fortunate enough to have a lot of stores.
Yeah. Yes.
What is your first do you remember, like, if one of your first experiences in a comic store as a
Yeah.
buyer,
Yeah. I like it was yesterday. I mean, here's the thing. I grew up in rural Alabama in the 1960s.
Mhm.
So getting comics meant going to Rexall Drugs, to Rexall Drugs, to Rexall Drugs, to the grocery store, to the convenience store, and hunting them down that way. It wasn't until I moved to Richmond with my family in '76, I guess. So in '77, I realized there was a comic shop in Richmond called
Mhm.
Nostalgia Plus, and it lit me up. I mean, I begged my dad to take me there. I went. I walked in. I was overwhelmed by the selection of new comics because at that time newsstands were running about 4 or 5 weeks behind comic stores. So suddenly it's like comics from the future, all of a sudden, all in my face. And that, became a lifelong habit. It just became a
Yeah,
lifelong habit. Yeah.
and it's such a special place. I like to think of comic stores are kind of the last frontier mixed with record stores and a couple other types of stores, but the last frontier of small business, uniquely small, individually owned businesses in this country that we just don't see anymore, and it's
That
such a
act,
charming thing.
here, that act as social hubs. That's the important thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Nostalgia Plus, not so much. It was run by some grumpy guy named Mark who, couldn't, I could tell couldn't care less. But uh, since then, when I moved to Dallas, there were a ton of comic stores there. Bob
Mhm.
Wayne's store was there back in the day, and
Yeah.
Buddy Saunders' stores were there, and that's where you would just hang out and
Mhm.
meet members of your ilk and
Yeah.
make connections there. That's how I met Kevin. Yeah.
That's and it still is a beautiful thing because there are so many stores that provide that, and, I'm fortunate in the Northwest because we've got, a lot of stuff in Seattle, but Portland has
No,
Portland's a comics town.
you can throw
It
a
really
stick
is.
store in Portland. I envy you. Yes.
I lived down there. It's funny. I lived down there for 9 months. I actually worked for the CBLDF,
Mhm.
right before the pandemic hit, but that's a different story for another time with a lot of heartbreak. Um, so what was the first, what drew you to Superman? Is there a certain story that drew you to Superman when you were younger that, obviously stuck?
There wasn't a specific story. There was an
Mhm.
event that, and I told the story before. Forgive me if you've heard it before, but I like Superman when I was a kid, but I also like Batman and I like Spider-Man. I like comics. I like, you know, magic tricks and I like cars and I like dinosaurs or whatever. I liked a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
But I went to see the Christopher Reeve Superman movie in 1979, January 26, 1979, which is the day that changed my life forever. Uh, Sat through that movie. This is the short version of the story, but sat through
Mhm.
that movie and was so captivated and
Yeah.
so enraptured by Christopher Reeve as Superman that I came out of that movie theater knowing that whatever I was going to do with the rest of my life, it was going to have something to do with Superman.
That's amazing. Not too many people can have that and then execute that
And then
and,
execute
you know
that. And, and I know the day, I know the time of day, I remember what shirt I was wearing. That was the moment that changed my life. And as you say, I'm lucky enough to be one of those who was then able to turn that into reality.
Yeah, yeah, and it yeah, I was born about 9 months after that came out, that movie, but I remember seeing it, and I would think there was a piece of me that always loved Superman from that moment on, but it was kinda once I found Batman, things changed a little bit,
Sure.
and I was like, "Oh, that's my guy. That's
Yeah.
my guy."
That's
Um,
that's a generational thing. I mean, that's if you had been,
sure.
it's because the Michael Keaton movie hit you the same way that Christopher Reeve hit
Yes.
me because we were about the
Yeah.
same age at that point. Yeah.
That movie did change everything, and,
Yeah.
it opened me up to this whole world, and my parents had bought me a bunch of Batman books when I was younger, and I, connected those dots very quickly.
Yeah.
Um, I do wanna jump ahead to something that I didn't know you were doing until recently, the Humanoids you're working with Humanoids Publishing still, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, no, and that one of I Mobius is one of those more recent discoveries in my life, so it's something that fascinates me
What a
completely.
supremely talented human being. I mean, one of the greatest of all. He's the Mount Rushmore of comics has got to have Mobius on it. I
Mhm,
was lucky enough. I left that gig about a year and a half ago, maybe a little longer,
mhm.
on good terms because I like the people there a lot. But I had been consulting there as a sort of a troubleshooter once or twice a week since
Mhm.
before the pandemic. So I could about 5 years ago I started there. I'd go in maybe once or twice a week and solve whatever problems they had because they were brand new at doing American comics and I was the old
Right.
hand. So, I would come in and be able to troubleshoot. And that eventually led to the offer of being publisher. So being
Mhm.
and so I thought, oh, that's a real step up, and that's something I have not done for a long time, and it's another thing to put on my resume. Not that I am, not that I'm worried about building a resume so much as
Yeah.
I I seek out the parts of the job that I still haven't really done. That's
Mhm.
why I owned a comic store for a couple of years, mostly
Yeah.
because I just wanted that I wanted that experience. I wanted to have done everything there is to do in comics, and I think I have now. Um, all this to say, Humanoids work there. Started the day before the pandemic, the day before the whole
Whoa.
world shut down, and I did my level best at that job at that time for labored on for a couple of years. I was working with some really good people. We put out some excellent books, several award nominated books,
Mhm.
but it it was just not in the cards for me to figure out how to do this job on the fly remotely through Zoom. It's
Yeah.
just if I had been in the office 5 days a week, I know I could have done a better job. If I had been in the office 5 days a week, I would have learned the job much quicker. But I mean, I was there for 2 years, and when I left, there was still stuff I didn't know about my job.
Wow.
So I did my best. But in that time, like I said, we launched, at my insistence, we launched a library of Jodorowsky's material,
Yeah.
modeled, in my mind, on the Karl Barks library stuff that
Mhm.
a lot of stuff, and got to work with some amazing people.
That's I mean, and it's like you said, you wanted to try it, and you get to
Yeah,
try it. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Karl Barks. Uh, he's somebody that I got one of their big oversized, hardcovers recently, and
yeah,
it's unbelievable how the flow of his comics is the best. It like, there's almost nothing that you can put above it. You read those stories, and you may not even have an interest in those characters, but you start reading, and you can't stop.
you can't
He
stop.
was
He was
yeah.
astounding. I mean, the stories are funny in places. They're meant to be funny in places that don't land because we're grown men.
Mhm.
Um, but they are full of adventure, and they're full of heart. And I could just sit there and read that stuff all day. I'm a big fan of what Barks did, and also what Don Rosa did with Uncle Scrooge.
Yeah.
That stuff is timeless, and the Don Rosa stuff, especially the Life and Times of Uncle Scrooge, is
Mhm.
something I give as a gift on a regular basis to people who have kids who want to get into comics, or maybe interested, because I just
Mhm.
think that's a bellwether book in this
It
industry.
Yeah, yeah, and, Barks, it's interesting too because, obviously as time goes on, stuff doesn't age well. Some stuff doesn't. A
Right,
lot of the old Disney stuff from the '30s, we don't even wanna we'll just pretend, yeah.
right,
But Barks stuff ages pretty well. Like,
yeah,
he seemed to have, like, a good way of telling story without making anything seem kind of cringy,
yeah, pretty much.
30, 50, 60 years later.
Right. I mean, there's, like you said, there's places here and there. When you go to ancient native lands, it's never pleasant.
Right.
Uh, but he was certainly very progressive in terms of how he treated female characters. He was very progressive in how he treated, you know, kids and stories and stuff. It was, if you can accept that you're rooting for a billionaire in
Yeah, yeah, that's the only problem with it.
2023, then you could conceivably get into these stories. I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle for most people now.
Right. But it's done with a certain charm and,
Yeah,
Scrooge is generational because I grew up watching the, DuckTales
yes,
cartoon and,
sure.
you know, you can't really swim through all those gold coins, you'd probably kill yourself, but hey, it's
But
fun to imagine.
yep.
Uh, I did, somebody had asked me to ask you, and I kind of echo this sentiment.
Mm,
You wrote a book or six-part book, The History of the Marvel Universe.
yeah.
How much of that was already in here, and how much of that was research that you had to do? Like, what's the process of writing something like that?
When I took the gig, I
Mhm,
assumed that most of it was up here. I
mhm.
was so wrong. I was so wrong, because I went into the job knowing that there were about, the last, I don't know, 15 years worth of Marvels that I was sort of spotty on having read. I didn't, but what I hadn't taken into, so I figured this is 15 years of stuff I have to kind of catch up on. But what I hadn't counted on was that it's not just 15 years of comics, it's 15 years of retcons as well.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's the part that made it so difficult, is that a lot of the stuff I knew wasn't, had been amended or changed or wasn't really
yeah.
anymore. Luckily, Tom Brevoort and the research gang, if you look in the back of all those issues, there's text that sort of
Yeah.
supplement those guys did the yeoman's work. They put together a general page by page outline for me, which I was free to morph and change and add and subtract or
Mhm.
whatever. But at least it was a starting point.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and it's a chronology, if you like a one sentence chronology, if you will, event for event. And then I just sat down with my Wikipedia open in one window and my Word document open in the other, and learned an awful lot about Mr. Sinister. Um,
Yeah,
so
it's a lot.
it's a lot. It was a blast to do, and
Mhm.
And the art in that thing is so spectacular. It's so engaging. The goal was to not make it read like a 120-page Wikipedia entry.
Right.
So the art accomplished that, and the fact that we were able to actually make a story out of it that frames the whole thing was very important to me too.
Yeah, it's a lot different than those old handbooks of the Marvel Universe, which after, like, 4 or 5 pages, you're just like, "I can't read this anymore."
Yeah, exactly. You hand me one and I dive in like a porpoise, and then 5 pages in, I'm like, geez, I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then you go to the front, you're like, "Okay, who did the art in here? Okay, I'll
yeah,
just look at that instead."
yeah.
Uh, it's interesting, and I wonder, do you see yourself at some point maybe writing a giant-sized coffee table book of the history of comics?
Not so much because I think that I don't know that I have anything informationally new to bring to the
Mhm.
table. I think that the stuff that Tomorrow's has been doing with their American comic book history volumes has been spectacularly well researched and
Mhm.
really the go to. I somewhere in the back of my head, I really would like to eventually do some sort of semi autobiographical
Yeah.
stuff. Not because I think I'm such an interesting person, because I'm not, but because I've been in so many interesting places and I've been
Sure.
lived through so many interesting times. And I've worked everywhere and I've seen everywhere and I've worked with everybody and I've met everybody. And it's just, I think there's a way to, I'm just trying to find a way to do that somewhere down the road where it's entertaining without and honest without being brutal.
Yeah.
So that's a tough
Well,
line to go.
there's a lot of I mean, I know, Wizard is such an interesting thing, that period of time in my life because yeah, and but it's unfortunate because it shaped a lot of us that,
Yes.
in their early 40s thinking one thing, but it wasn't, a lot of it wasn't honest and most of
Yeah.
it wasn't honest.
Most of it was.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, the way I look at it is there is a whole new generation of comic book collectors and readers right now that are getting a lot of dishonesty. So I think, maybe like you said, less brutal, but definitely there should be some oral history of a lot of the last, 40 years and more.
I think, yeah, I mean, Howard Chaykin's doing a great job of that with his Hey Kids Comics series.
Yeah, yeah,
They're doing where it's very, Romana Clay uh, look at the history of comics with the names vaguely changed, but
mhm,
you know anything about comics, you can pick out who's who,
yeah,
and it's really well done. I something in that ballpark would be fun for me to do before I forget everything, which is it can happen any day. I mean, more and more,
unfortunately.
just nothing, nothing more uncomfortable than seeing somebody you haven't seen for a long time in comics, and you sit down at dinner and they're like, "You remember that time that happened? That was so awesome," and I would have to nod
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I
you have to
don't
fake it.
remember, but it's so important to them that I remember that I'm just like, "Yeah, that was awesome."
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and, it's unfortunate, for so many reasons, like I said, but, the way that we were also as, collectors, kids, I'm 13, 12, whatever, when Valiant comes around and all that stuff comes around, and I'm just like, I didn't they took advantage of us, and Wizard is kinda at the center of that,
Oh yeah.
unfortunately,
I mean,
you know?
Wizard created the boom and the bust. Wizard,
Yeah,
by publishing their specious, let's say specious, price guides in the back
yeah,
of every magazine, and those magazines are everywhere and every newsstand and every grocery store. Then suddenly, every kid who read comics believed that he was an investor, and it was
yes,
big. There had been a comics price guide before that. It was issued annually. It was book form, but and some of us
yeah,
took it seriously, but it wasn't. You know, teenagers who were buying X-Men and Wolverine weren't slave to the comics buyer's guide or to the comics price guide, but
yeah,
putting it in the back of Wizard and hyping everything up and making up your own prices and creating really
top 10 lists.
and just it's blatant market manipulation.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
it made every kid believe that every comic he bought was going to be worth a fortune. And then, the death of Superman happened, and that was the complete apex
That
of it.
was
And then
it.
all at once, everybody started taking their comics to the store and well, this is what Wizard says it's worth, and they're worth nothing.
Right. Yeah, and it was nearly kind of like a payola thing with the advertising and then putting it on the cover and then putting it in the top 10 list. It's like,
Oh yeah.
but, you'll learn.
Oh yeah. That's stuff that I got to figure out a way to tell that story someday without indicting too many of, you know,
Yeah,
I was witness to a lot more manipulation than most
I'm
people realize.
sure. I'm sure, and, I just don't wanna see it repeated. As a seller myself, and that's
Yeah.
how we met at my table,
Yeah.
I'm a big comics fan. I'm a reader, I love art. There's things that I absolutely love for the art, like Todd behind me, and, there's stuff I love for the story, and, you know, I just try to steer people away from anything that I would say is hype,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's my job. It's my job literally to uh, be a positive influence on the people that are buying comics,
Sure.
and, it's something that's very interesting to me. Looping that in, what does
Mhm.
Mark Waid collect? I know you
Ah,
collect props, but what do you collect? Do you collect original art? Is there certain books that you're looking for at all times?
I I had just the greatest comic collection in the world, which I got rid of about 10 years ago, which was,
Mhm.
with the exception of Showcase 4, I think it was every DC comic from about 1955 on,
Wow.
and a ton of Golden Age stuff.
Yeah.
None of it in great shape, because I was never concerned about condition of a comic. I just wanted to read
Sure.
the so but once I realized so much of that was available digitally, if you know where to look, then I was willing to make that trade. Yes, like everybody, I love having a book in my hands. I love the paper. I love the smell,
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. But I'm willing to trade that for the fact that I can put 20,000 comics on my iPad.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's a beautiful thing.
yes, a beautiful thing. And so, what do I collect? I've started getting back into the DC's 100 pagers back in
Mhm.
73, 74,
Yeah.
75, just because it's a finite thing. That's an achievable collection. I
Mhm.
collect, as you say, props, specifically screen accurate stuff. And when I say screen accurate, that applies to comics as well. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, the guy who built my Phantom Zone projector is my hero. Ton of that around my house, and of all things, having nothing to do with comics, I collect Lego stuff.
Oh, wow.
I'm a
Nice.
collect is maybe the wrong word, but because it's not a matter of trading and selling and buying, but it's a matter of,
Right.
this is what I do to relax. Is
Yeah.
you buy those gigantic 4,000 piece adult Lego sets that you build the Coliseum or whatever, and I can do that for like 3 days, and it is the most relaxing thing in the world, because my job involves making decisions about
Mhm.
narrative every second, right? Like constantly, every
Mhm.
panel is a new decision, and you get fatigued. And it's just fun
Sure.
to sit down at a table and just be given a book of instructions, and all you got to do is follow the recipe, and it is so cathartic.
I understand that because I love jigsaw puzzles,
Yeah,
and between the YouTube show and I also have a podcast I edit, which is another type of puzzle, and
yeah,
those things kind of bring me that release of stress and just peace, you know?
yes. So
So
the house is full of giant Lego structures, to the point where I don't know. I'm looking around my living room. I don't know where I can put anything else anymore. So I'll find a place.
well, that's good to know. I'll have to, maybe I'll send you I have a lot of 100 pagers and, some of them are reader copies. I'd be happy to send you a bunch if you need any. Can always send you a list.
Yeah, we'll hook
Um,
up after this, and I'll let you know. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
there's still a dozen or so that I'm still looking for. So yeah.
Cool. Cool. Okay, so I have a question. I hope you don't get angry at me because I know your Flash is one of the biggest things piece of your career. My cousin was always a Flash fan. I was never a Flash reader. Where where would you suggest that I would start if I want to get a good dose of
Oh,
Wally
well,
West?
it is insanely self-serving to say this. It really is. But I think if you start with Born to Run, which was my first
On to
story,
run.
I think that is a good entry. And if you read those 4 issues and then decide you don't like Wally, then that's fine. But if you're
Okay.
gonna like him, you're gonna like him after that. But that is not to say that Bill Loebs before me didn't do excellent Flash work,
Mhm.
Wally, but he was still sort of considered by fans a stopgap. Everybody
Mhm.
was constantly wondering when Barry Allen was coming back and filling the suit again,
Yeah.
and that's the stuff that Bill had to labor underneath, and I was able to break away from that, and I think that that's what made Wally really Wally.
Okay.
I'm so uncomfortable saying that out loud because it's not
So it
not for me to say, but that's my answer.
well, I think of, if I'm gonna talk to somebody that knows the Flash better than most people, it's gonna be you.
Yeah,
So,
there is
and
that.
I'm also yeah, and I'm also a Bruce Springsteen fan, so the
Yeah,
title of that gives
there
me,
you go.
more pleasure to read it. Um, I wanted to see, we can if you don't wanna do it, that's fine, but I found something that I think is gonna surprise you for a little segment that I wanna
Okay.
call, "Can Mark Waid outsmart Mark Waid?"
Oh my
So we have
God.
Amazing Heroes 50.
Right.
The last page of this Amazing Heroes 50 is a pop quiz that you wrote, and would you
Yes.
be okay asking you the 12
Sure.
questions to see if you can get the answers?
Let's see if we can do it. It was a 50 themed question,
Yes,
I
yes, and
recall. Okay. And that was
this is from sorry, I didn't mean to
40
cut you off.
40 years ago. I'm surprised that thing isn't crumbling in your hands. So
I recently got a collection, somebody crispy copies of, like,
cool.
100 different Amazing
Cool.
Heroes.
All right, bring it on, and I will prepare myself for a nosedive. Go ahead.
Okay, the quiz is called 1L of a trivia quiz. Number 1, Johnny Storm began a short-lived college career in Fantastic Four 50. What was the name of the school?
Is it Empire State?
No, close.
No,
It's Metro College.
right off the bat. God. Okay. All right. I can do
I
better.
didn't
Okay.
get that right either.
Ah,
Uh, Brave and the Bold 50 began its tradition of team-ups with what 2 DC stars?
Green Arrow and Martian Manhunter. The
Boom.
idea
We
the idea was to replicate the success of Superman and Batman in World's Finest, and trying to find the characters that were closest to Superman and Batman, which at that time would have been Martian Manhunter and Green Arrow.
right. Yeah, that makes sense. One human, one not
Yeah,
human.
one
Yeah,
alien, one Batman riff. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, 3. Who starred in Marvel Premiere 50?
Alice Cooper.
Yeah, there we
Okay.
go.
Okay.
That that's a great issue.
Yeah.
Number 4, who guest starred in Justice League of America 50? I didn't get
Oh,
this.
did 50. Why am I having a hard time here? It because it wasn't Zatanna, that was 51. And it wasn't Metamorpho because it was 42. Robin.
That is the correct
Robin.
answer. Yeah. All right, 5. Government agent King Faraday was the star of Showcase 50 under the feature name of I Spy. These stories were reprints of what 50s DC comic?
Danger Trail.
That's the correct answer. I've never heard
Yeah.
of that before.
Yeah.
So that was news to me. Who is the villain of X-Men 50?
Magneto.
More specifically,
Oh, well, Magneto's daughter, Lorna
it's a
Dane,
it's a robot. It's a
as a robot, the
Magneto
Magneto
robot.
robot. Yes,
Yeah.
the later to be revealed a robot. Yes.
The best part about it is you wrote the answer, no points for Magneto. So if you say
Uh,
Magneto, you don't get
so I'm
points.
down 2. Okay.
What back feature began in Aquaman 50? What was so unusual about it?
It was Dead Man by Neil Adams, picking up from his Strange Adventures run. And what was interesting was that it tied into the main feature.
Yes, without Aquaman's knowledge, which
Right.
is interesting. Yeah, Neil Adams, oh my god, what a his
Yeah.
Dead Man. I mean, he legend in his own,
Oh,
own club, but his Dead Man
the
stuff is
very first
amazing.
artist I recognized by name, and my favorite. Well, I mean, that was a bucket list item to be able to work with him on that Fantastic Four thing.
Oh, that's awesome.
All right.
Um, oh, so we're on question 8. What longtime Iron Man menace made his debut in Tales of Suspense 50?
The Mandarin.
That's the
All
correct answer.
right.
I guessed that, but then
Mm-hmm.
my brain's like, "Wait, was it Whiplash?" But no,
Yeah.
it was Mandarin. Uh, okay, number 9. For that matter, another major Marvel character appeared in the Spider-Man 50. What's his name?
Oh, Kingpin.
Yes. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that was the lob. That was the soft
that was it.
question.
That was a softball.
Yeah. All right. 10. Robin the Boy Wonder once fought a crook named Finley, whose gimmick was always giving his adversaries an even break. What was Finley's nickname?
50-50.
There you go.
Yep.
Uh, Number 11. Where did Superboy find white kryptonite?
In the 50th century. I love that question. I
That's a
love that.
great question.
What kryptonite was discovered for the first time long after Superman was dead? Yes.
What do you remember what I don't know, but do you remember what book that's from? Like where that
Yeah, Adventure
that
279. Please, come on. We can't believe you even had to ask. Adventure 279. It's
all
Superboy
right.
visits the 50th century. Yes.
Okay. And then 12,
Mhm.
finally, what year is generally considered to mark the end of the golden age?
I remember writing this one. It's 1951.
That's right. And you're right, 1951, sucker.
Sucker.
And that
Exactly.
so Mark Waid is almost, your
Almost.
brain
Yeah.
is almost there from 40 years ago, which is great. We'll have to
Yeah,
ask you
I
that
don't know
one.
if I don't know if that would pass as a technical cognitive exam, but I don't think I want to take it to my neurologist and use that as
No,
evidence. But yes, luckily, I can't believe I whiffed on those two. But anyway,
it's okay. It's
uh,
okay. Nobody's gonna judge you, I promise.
I'm judging.
Because if you asked Dave from, even 20 years ago, you'd be like, I don't know. I don't
It,
remember that.
what's funny, and this is the God's honest truth, is that any writer in comics will tell you the same thing. I can remember a lot of stuff I've read, but I can remember
Mhm.
nothing of what I wrote. I
That's
really, most of us can't. Most of us are, if we go back and look at our own work, we're like, holy shit, I wrote that. That's pretty good.
well, wouldn't that be it makes sense because you're trying to get a story out of your head
Right.
onto the
Not,
paper. You're
not
not trying to
into it.
bring it in.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's one of the things that does fascinate me about the human brain and creativity is just it shows there's no limits and
Right.
you're always trying to get it out.
Right.
Um, I know we're getting close to the end. I
Yeah, we've
do
got a couple more minutes if you don't mind. So I don't mean to cut out
Yeah,
early, but as you
it's
know,
okay. You're
85
busy.
comics to write. So yeah.
Yeah, you are a busy person. I do wanna ask, I know you were the editor and kind of like there right at the beginning for, Elseworlds, and I
Yeah.
find Elseworlds to be the best piece of DC over time. Like, there's always some interesting story that, sure, it doesn't belong in continuity, but it needs to be told.
Yeah.
And, Kingdom Come obviously is your mark on that as a writer. Uh, just is there anything about Elseworlds that speaks to you still, or something anything what are your thoughts on Elseworlds?
I was proud to be there at the beginning. I was proud to help launch it with Brian Augustine, with Gotham by Gaslight. I was
Mhm.
proud to see it sort of manifest over the years and take hold and more Elseworlds. And then it just went insane. And I remember distinctly standing in a Toys R Us aisle in the action
Mhm.
figure aisle with Brian. We were there for his kid. And we're looking at the action figure aisle at all of the variant Batmans on the pegs,
Yeah, yeah.
Batman and Pirate Batman and stuff. There seemed like 100 of them. We looked at each other like, this is our fault. you know, we did this. This is the Pandora's box we opened. Um, I think DC made a really smart choice in 97, 98, maybe, where they basically just said, we're out. We're tapping out on Elseworlds for a while.
Yeah.
Because I saw a list of the proposed Elseworlds that were tentatively on the schedule, and I'm not making this up. One of them was the Flash in the Crimean War. And that is the absolute bottom of the barrel that you were scraping at that point. So
Yeah.
give it a rest. But that said, there were some great stories told out of that. And it goes to what we've always been saying, which is that, continuity is a tool. It's
Sure.
not, shouldn't be a straitjacket. Just tell a good story.
Yeah. Yeah, and I some of those stories, the Batman Dracula trilogy is by far one of my favorite Batman stories of all time. I mean, Kelly Jones's art doesn't really hurt
Yeah.
it. It's one of those things that you just look at it, you're like, "Why did we
Oh,
never do
yeah.
this?"
Batman Holy
You
Terror is a
know?
great, great comic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's something that I would love to see them try and do some Elseworlds DCU stuff. The movie stuff would be
I think you're
interesting.
kind I think you're kind of seeing it a little bit. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
we're, I mean, not fully and officially and under that banner, but the edict of DC right now is just tell a good story. I mean,
Yes.
is World's Finest in continuity? Yes, but there's liberty taken. So yeah,
And that I do want to touch on that.
yeah,
You've got World's Finest, the Teen Titans. I just read the
yeah,
first issue, and I've never read a Teen Titans book in my life, and I
yeah.
really enjoyed it because it feels like it's set in the time where we are right now, in the terminology, the way that they're talking and they're acting. Kids do act like that these days.
That's just it. I mean, yeah, it's all about Speedy being the social media whore. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's I don't know, I don't set out to go, okay, what are the kids looking at these days,
Yeah.
but I am technologically savvy enough to pay attention to what's going on in the world today. I don't the trick to writing teenagers is to not try to make it
Right.
hip. Don't use don't use slang, just don't,
Yeah.
because whatever slang you use is going to date terribly. So
And
make up your
it's
own or just find some other way to say it. That's the trick.
yeah, yeah, and, I will say, it's just I'm going to keep reading it because
Nice.
I there's just something I gravitated a lot towards not just the independent stuff, but the not non-superhero. I'm
Right.
just you get burnt out after a while reading the same characters over and over. So I'm like, "Okay, well, I guess I'm gonna be reading Teen Titans now because I've never done it before."
It's character driven. I mean, really heavily character driven. Did you see it across the Spider Verse?
I did. I
There's
loved it.
I
Absolutely.
loved it, but here's where I started to hit the wall. Was
Mhm.
the big fight scene where they're chasing Miles across the spider.
Yeah.
It went on for forever. It went on forever, and it was fun to watch. And it was fun to look at, and it was entertaining. But it it was so long
It
that
was a very long
a
scene. Yeah.
very long sequence. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is why I don't write fight scenes in my comics if I can help it, because I've seen everything, and
Yeah.
there's nothing you're showing me here that I haven't seen somewhere in my comics reading time. And I appreciate what you're doing, and I know I'm not your audience, but oh my god, please. Other than that, I mean, a really great and enjoyable movie. I don't want to take away from that, but this is, to echo what you're saying. There's only so many fight scenes you can read at any
Yes.
given time without just wanting to get to some character stuff.
Yeah. No, and Last Days of Luther is character stuff.
It is
It's
all straight up stuff.
yeah.
Every story, that's where stories begin. Stories begin with character. If you're not
Yep.
interested in the people who are in the story, then it doesn't matter what you do. It's all emotion. It's all about characters, and it's all about how they feel, how they react to the world. So anyway, that may be a good note to go out on.
Sure, sure. You got plenty of books that are coming out. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Plug cons that you're going to be at? Anything like that?
I will be in Austin in 2 weeks. I will be in the Baltimore show the weekend after that. There is a Superman festival in Cleveland in October that a bunch of us Superman guys will be at.
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
and I encourage people to look up Superman Celebration on the web
Okay.
and see what interests you there. Um, that's convention appearances, and then in terms of comics, it's World's Finest Teen Titans, it's World's Finest Batman and Superman, it is Shazam,
Mhm.
which we can talk about next time.
Yeah.
It is it is two yet to be announced projects from DC that are pretty big,
Okay.
and both of them are involving. One of them is involving an old collaborator of mine who I cannot wait to work with again.
Oh,
Um,
that's great.
and there's other stuff. There's I'm as you said, I'm a very prolific man.
Yes, you don't stop, and
Nope.
that's a great thing for everybody that's picking up comics every week because we need more of that.
Thank you.
So, Mark, I truly appreciate the time today, and I hope we can talk again because there's a lot of bullet point words and things that I wrote down that I'm just like, yeah, yep, all right, just keep those
Yeah,
words there and
yeah,
we'll
but
get
here's
to
the
it.
thing you weren't taking into account is that I love answering questions, and if you ask me what time it is, I will tell you how to build a watch. So there, I am nothing if not long-winded. So keep that
Thank you.
bullet point list handy, and maybe next time.
Yeah, and maybe I'll find another quiz that we can challenge Mark Waid on Mark
Yeah.
Waid.
All right. I'll be thinking now. You bastard. You golly.
I found it and I was just like, this is going to be great if he's game
Perfect.
for it.
What is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
What has he forgotten in 42 years? Anyway. All right. I've got to split.
All right, Mark. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right.